Welcome back to a new edition of the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. Setting a strategy in your life. In this segment, I want to talk about what I feel is one of the most important aspects of the Shinsei method. It's really setting a strategy for yourself that's individually suitable to you. Now, in order to do that, it's important to understand something about you, and that's one of the reasons I developed the Shinsei method as a method of self-training, because I found that there's not a lot of practical advice on how to solve a lot of the real-world problems that you'll have to face when you're younger and even when you get older. What I found as I got older is, even though I haven't changed fundamentally in terms of value, structure, and character and what's important to me, what has changed is my recognition of the fact that not a lot of people give you support for those values, even when those values may be rational and may benefit them. And I found that throughout life and in many social settings, particularly work and family, which has a direct bearing on what you can do in your life, it can determine where you live, with whom you interact, and then of course that affects your quality of life. Now, a lot of people belittle and demean the idea of quality of life as if it's something not very important. Well, I can tell you it's very important, because all you have in your life is your life, the time that you spend on the earth. And if those minutes of the days or the hours and the days and the years are low quality, that very often will lead to a level of unhappiness. And again, I'm speaking from personal experience. Now, sometimes you can't control your environment. Sometimes you are in situations, maybe you were born in a country that is not as rich as other countries, and so your limitations or your choices may be somewhat limited, of course. That goes without saying. Some people are more fortunate and they can become more wealthy, and then they have more choices. That doesn't mean that they're bad. That doesn't mean that they're good. That doesn't mean that life is unfair, therefore don't try, and all of the other kinds of things that many people will encourage you to conclude, irrationally, I might add. And it's very easy to make those kind of conclusions, particularly when you are constantly faced with a level of unfairness. However, there are many unfair situations in life, unfortunately. You do have a lot of control over how you react to those unfair situations. And that is an important lesson that it took me a long time to learn. It is a lesson that I originally learned from a psychologist. Now, I'm not a psychologist and I don't offer psychological advice, but I've had to study a lot of psychology in order to understand something about myself and deal with real-world problems such as the feeling of depression, the feeling of isolation, the feeling of pointlessness and worthlessness and hopelessness. All of these kinds of things are very real emotions, I have found. And they can be relatively easy to conclude for yourself, again, irrationally, but they can be easy to conclude if every step of the way and in every social setting that you encounter, the people that you encounter, number one, don't offer support. If you're striving toward value, as I advocate with the Shinsei method, I've talked about this on many segments of the show that you can find at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel, but you can also find more information at the shinseimethod.com, the Shinsei Method website, shinseimethod.com. And I've talked about this idea many times that in many social settings you don't get a lot of support. And I've talked about this idea of striving for value. And it's very important to strive for value because that gives you an anchor. It gives you a waypoint. This is how I developed the Shinsei method and how I came to this conclusion of developing a method that served as really a map for yourself. Navigation, particularly land navigation, has been very important to me. Compasses, reading maps, map reading. Now, I'm not an expert, but I do like to hike and I do like to understand something about where I'm going. And I feel it's a very important life's endeavor as well. And there's a lot of very valuable insights to this idea of navigation. The idea of navigation and finding your way is ultimately, I found, what life is all about. Finding your way in school, in work, in family. Now, if you're the type of person that's following a method like the Shinsei method, an orientation, a way, a do, taking from the idea of martial arts and Bushido. Way means, or do means way, loosely translated from the Japanese. Bushido was called the way of the samurai with the bushi. And it really is a way of or a way of looking at things, and really a way of orienting yourself to various situations in life. They directed the samurai, the bushi, directed their attention, of course, to war fighting. But the idea of dealing with a challenge and facing a challenge doesn't have to be as extreme as self-defense, war fighting, or combat, but the concept still applies. One of the martial arts that I studied, I felt was one of the best. It was a self-defense system. And this self-defense system, to my knowledge, it was the only one that ever did that. He required for people who achieved black belt to write PhD level theses on specific topics pertaining to self-defense and martial arts, preparedness, etc. I chose the philosophy of self-defense, the philosophy of war, because I found that in a lot of situations, life can be considered to be war, or you can think that life is war. People are deceptive in many situations. They're very confrontational. They can be hostile toward things like value. And I continue to find that when you are approaching life as if it's war, a lot of those principles are directly applicable to in terms of self-protection, self-defense, being prepared, being reactive, being flexible, being fluid. All of these things that apply to war can also apply to everyday life. Now, of course, self-defense in war and war fighting those are life and death endeavors. They're very extreme. I'm not talking about that except for self-defense. And hopefully you never experience that. I'm not a self-defense teacher per se, but I have studied self-defense for many, many years. And I've taught at a student level other students who were lower than my rank was at the time when I was studying it. So I'd been studying this idea of Bushido, self-defense, and personal combat, hand-to-hand combat for many, many years. And there's a lot of personal insights that I've gleaned, and one of those insights is this idea of preparedness and being prepared for life's challenges. Well, that, I have found, is an example of striving for value. The ultimate value is life. Life is worth defending and protecting. So if life is worth protecting and defending, it behooves you to find out how to do that. That was at least my logic for pursuing self-defense. But it has a direct bearing on your everyday life, because when you are striving towards something, and I wanted to use self-defense as an example, but you can use any example when you're striving for value. Health, striving for health, eating right, sleeping right, any of these kinds of things that build and construct, I have found don't get a lot of support in many social settings. And that can be direct or indirect. It can be direct in terms of people just call you an alien. I have been in many social settings where I didn't drink and I don't smoke. And I've been called an alien for that. Not, I have not met too many people who don't drink and don't smoke. That is great. I would like to do that more. I would like to emulate that, because people talk all the time about setting an example. Well, that's an example, leading by example. That's an example of setting an example. But in most social situations that I've encountered, in fact, I have not encountered anybody when they found out that I don't drink and don't smoke, that they encourage me. What they said usually was, you're an oddball. Well, that is a direct example of direct social pressure on you not to pursue the value of health in that case. Same thing with self-defense. If you're in a social setting and you want to be careful, you want to double check locks, for example, you want to make sure that things are secure before you leave. Maybe you want to take a flashlight with you whenever you drive, because you never know what might happen. And even in the daytime, if you have to look in a car or try to find something, you often need a flashlight. So it's very good to have that. So if you're the type of person, as I am, who wants to take flashlights and make sure that those flashlights are portable and they work and there's enough beam power, these are all examples, practical examples, and I can give you many more in work, in finance, in investing. And I'm not an investment advisor, but I am a personal investor, and I like the practice of investing. There's a lot of very valuable insights from this idea of investing, as I've talked about in many segments of the show, which you can find at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel or shinseimethod.com. But there's a lot of very valuable insights to this idea of investing. You're investing your time, your money. In the case of financial investing, it's money, but it's also time. Time is life, because you spend time of your life, which you don't get back. And so when you're doing that, and the idea of investing is very useful, because when you think about investing, people understand that it's very valuable. Money is valuable, so they want to protect and guard it. Perfect sense. Makes a lot of sense. The breakdown I found usually comes when you want to apply that same thing to things like health, personal safety, security, intelligence, talent. Your time is talent, your things that you can do. All of these kinds of intangibles, I will call them, are also very valuable. Now, if you establish your life so that you strive toward that kind of value, those are all constructive values, you're going to be, in a lot of situations, very solitary. You're going to be isolated, I found, in many social settings. People will call you alien and look at you like you're crazy. And maybe they won't be as direct as people have been with me with drinking, for example, and call you alien. But maybe they just don't show any interest. That's an example of an indirect social pressure. And you get them all. Direct, indirect. It all comes down and boils down to the same thing. A very strong current of discouragement for striving for value. And that's why I developed the Shinsei method, and that's why I found it so very important. So when you're thinking about doing things like establishing a strategy for yourself, be aware that in most social settings, if you implement that strategy, whether you tell people about that strategy or not, you're not going to get a lot of social support. So you do need a fair amount of what I call a pillar of individuality, well-being, and profitability, self-trust. I add to those two other pillars, inner strength, inner balance. I found that they're all interrelated. It's very difficult to have self-trust without inner strength and inner balance. It's very difficult to have inner balance without a certain level of self-trust and inner strength. They're almost interchangeable, but not completely. And I have found that the basis for all of those pillars, for those three pillars, is really self-trust. Trusting yourself. Trusting that the strategy you've developed for yourself in terms of career, in terms of family, deciding where you want to live, with whom you want to interact, the kind of career that you choose. I found that career is one of the most important decisions you'll make in your life, even more so than marriage and friendship and all the rest of it. Because a lot of times marriage and friendship and where you live has a lot to do with your career. How you live has a lot to do with where you live. The kinds of people you interact has a lot to do with where you live. Where you live has a lot to do with where you can afford. Where you can afford has a lot to do with career. Now that's a very important piece of career advice that you don't get in many career placement centers. And if you're thinking about career, it's not just a matter of money only. And in the long term, it is. But it's also, money has a lot to do with what you can do well and what you enjoy doing, at least to some degree. And all of those are interrelated, and it behooves you to sit down and think about that. The earlier the better. Because the earlier you think about that, the more likely you are to stay in a career. The more likely you are to stay in a career over a period of time, the more likely you are to earn a significant amount during the time when you can earn a significant amount in your life over that period of time. And then you can decide, in many cases, where you live, with whom you interact. And you won't be in social settings, as I found myself, where you're living, let's say, in an apartment where the people around you seem to have a lot of mental problems. In fact, they do. Just recently, I had that experience. And I'll end this segment with a personal example and why it's so very important. Very recently, in fact, Halloween 2022. Halloween, I usually like that as a day because it's a very interesting time of the year. It happens to fall in the month where I was born. I was born in October. So I like this time of year, and I happen to like Halloween some of the old horror movies, etc. It's just interesting to watch. There's no spiritual significance that I attach to it, but I just happen to like it as a practice. Maybe because when I was a kid, I did a lot of trick-or-treating when you could do those kinds of things. And I don't eat candy per se anymore unless it's sugar-free, but there was a nice experience that I had, and I've talked about my childhood and many other situations. So you may understand if you've seen some of the other segments that I've done that my childhood was not the happiest. So those kind of things like trick-or-treating and other kinds of small things, riding a bike, I still enjoy today. And I think that that's probably one of the reasons. I couldn't find that much joy in the family life that I had, so I had to find it in other kinds of things. Catching bees, looking at flowers, which I happen to like today, to this day, macro photography, and I can understand why. I've always had that interest. So that is an example. I just wanted to give you some personal examples of pursuing individual interests and values in your life to enhance the quality of your life. And it's so important because you may find yourself, like I was explaining, when you're living in an apartment and on Halloween, one of the neighbors where I live seemed to have a nervous breakdown. She was yelling out of the window, pacing frantically, chanting. It seemed weird. Someone called the police. The police showed up with mental health care workers. It was a very serious situation, but not that unusual. Now, I took the approach, as I often do, that this has to be addressed. You can't just ignore this sort of thing. A mental disturbance indicates a very serious situation that has to be addressed at some level. There has to be some kind of intervention. Either the individual has to take an intervention for themselves and do something about it, or there has to be some outside intervention. But that's the kind of approach that I take, and I've explained this to other people, told people that what happened. Crickets. No response. No one wanted to talk about it. No one wanted to deal with it. It was left alone. The next day it was as if nothing happened. That's what I mean when you get a lot of social pressure, both indirect and direct. When you want to take corrective action, when you want to strive toward value, when you want to build and construct, most of the reactions from people that you get are going to be downplaying it, discouraging it, demoralizing it. Whether they do it intentionally or not, it really doesn't make any difference because the result is the same. You have to reach inside to find the extra wherewithal, willpower, inner strength, to strive toward those things that do build and that can be shown to be valuable, rational, objectively helpful, and continue to strive toward those important values, sometimes alone, as Winston Churchill was indicating in one of his most famous speeches, another very inspirational person to me. When he was talking about what Great Britain may have to and would have to do if they were going to survive during World War II, he said that what we will do, if necessary, is continue to fight, if necessary, alone. And that's sometimes what you have to be willing to do. I highly recommend his speeches because they are very inspirational and they have a lot to do with the kind of attitude that is important to establish for yourself when you want to do things just as simple as strive for value. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, when we talk about subjects related to your health, until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.